Good evening, my friend. I hope today has finally loosened its grip on you. Perhaps it was one of those days where every small responsibility quietly gathered friends until your mind felt like an overcrowded medieval marketplace full of people shouting over one another while nobody actually bought anything. Or perhaps your thoughts simply decided that bedtime was the perfect opportunity to review every awkward conversation you've ever had since childhood. Human brains have always possessed remarkable timing. Fortunately, history reminds us that our ancestors carried worries just as peculiar, though theirs often involved invisible spirits, wandering saints, or whether offending a colony of bees might somehow invite bad fortune upon the household. So before we wander into tonight's curious corner of the medieval world, allow your shoulders to sink just a little lower. Let your jaw relax. Let your breathing slow until it feels less like work and more like a quiet tide moving in and out. Tonight, we are visiting monastery gardens, village orchards, and humble cottages where thousands of tiny winged creatures buzzed through daily life, not merely as makers of honey, but as mysterious companions believed to understand secrets that human beings could never quite grasp. If someone from the 21st century stepped into an ordinary European village around the year 1251, of the first surprises would probably not be the castle on the hill or the church standing proudly at the center of the settlement. It might instead be the soft humming that floated through the air on warm afternoons. Bees were everywhere. They drifted among herb gardens, behind monasteries, hovered over apple blossoms, beside cottages, explored patches of wildflowers, beyond wooden fences, and disappeared into carefully maintained hives that stood almost like respected members of the community. Modern people often think of bees as useful insects, excellent pollinators that produce honey before returning politely to the background of everyday life. Medieval Europeans certainly appreciated the practical value of bees, but they rarely regarded them as merely insects. That simple word hardly captured what many believed they truly were. To understand why, it helps to forget everything modern science has taught us for a little while. Imagine living in a world where almost every mystery lacked an obvious explanation. The changing seasons, sudden illness, unusually good harvests, frightening storms, unexpected recoveries, and strange coincidences all seem connected to invisible forces moving quietly through creation. God watched over humanity. Angels carried divine messages. Saints intervened in earthly affairs. Demons sought opportunities wherever people grew careless. Forests possessed ancient reputations. Rivers carried legends. Certain crossroads inspired hesitation. Animals occasionally behaved as though they knew things people did not. Bees fit naturally into that landscape because they already appeared almost miraculous without requiring much imagination. Think about them from medieval eyes. Tiny creatures that somehow built perfect geometric homes. Workers who labored tirelessly without apparent argument. Colonies ruled by a mysterious sovereign that most people mistakenly believed to be a king for centuries before discovering otherwise. Insects capable of transforming ordinary flower nectar into golden sweetness unlike anything else found in nature. Flying beings that defended their homes with fearless determination despite their delicate size. Even today, bees inspire admiration. 800 years ago, they seemed positively enchanted. Ancient writers had already filled Europe with stories about bees long before the Middle Ages arrived. Classical Roman authors admired their discipline, comparing orderly hives to well-governed kingdoms. Christian thinkers later found even richer symbolism. A hive resembled the ideal religious community. Every member served a purpose. Nobody worked only for themselves. Individual sacrifice supported collective survival. Monks copied these comparisons into manuscripts generation after generation until they became almost second nature. It was difficult to spend years inside a monastery without eventually hearing someone praise bees as examples of diligence, humility, obedience, and harmonious labor. Monastic gardens therefore became some of Europe's finest centers of beekeeping. At first glance, this appears entirely practical. Monasteries required honey for cooking, preserving fruit, sweetening medicines, and occasionally improving rather plain meals. Even more important, they needed beeswax. Before widespread availability of cheaper alternatives, centuries later, beeswax produced the highest quality candles. Unlike tallow candles made from animal fat, beeswax burned with cleaner flames, emitted far less unpleasant smoke, and carried a faintly pleasant fragrance. Churches depended upon them during Mass. Altars glowed beneath their light. Monks read manuscripts by their steady flames during long evenings. Great cathedrals shimmered beneath thousands of tiny golden lights, each one quietly reminding worshippers that entire colonies of bees had made such moments possible. It is oddly comforting to imagine that some of Europe's most magnificent religious ceremonies depended upon countless insects, patiently visiting flowers, one blossom at a time. Human beings often enjoy imagining themselves as masters of civilization. Medieval Christianity quite literally illuminated its holiest spaces through the patient labor of creatures scarcely larger than a thumb. Practical usefulness alone, however, does not explain the affection medieval people felt toward bees. Plenty of useful animals existed. Chickens produced eggs. Oxen pulled plows, sheep supplied wool. Yet none acquired quite the same spiritual reputation. Bees occupied a curious middle ground between livestock and mystery. One explanation emerged from their apparent purity. Medieval observers noticed that bees gathered sweetness from flowers without visibly damaging them. They seemed clean, industrious, peaceful unless provoked. Their products smelled pleasant rather than offensive. Honey resisted spoilage remarkably well compared with many foods. Beeswax burned beautifully. In an age constantly surrounded by mud smoke, animal waste, spoiled food, disease, and unpleasant odors, bees appeared strangely untouched by corruption. Many religious writers delighted in using them as symbols of moral cleanliness. Some even argued that bees demonstrated virtues many humans struggled to achieve. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of a monk composing such comparisons, while occasionally glancing through a small window toward buzzing hives outside. Unlike us, the bees waste no time gossiping. Unlike us, the bees labor without complaint. Unlike us, the bees build together. Unlike us, the bees remember their purpose. Human beings have always enjoyed finding moral lessons inside hard-working animals. Bees practically volunteered. Of course, medieval people also misunderstood much about bee biology, which only deepened their sense of wonder. For centuries, many believed bees reproduced without ordinary mating. Some ancient authorities insisted colonies somehow generated themselves from mysterious natural processes. Others imagined miraculous forms of reproduction more fitting for creatures associated with purity. These misunderstandings blended beautifully with Christian symbolism surrounding virginity, divine order, and miraculous creation. Scientific accuracy mattered far less than spiritual meaning. And then there was honey itself. Today, honey waits quietly on supermarket shelves inside identical jars. Medieval Europeans experienced it differently because sweetness remained comparatively rare. Sugar existed, but arrived in Europe only in limited quantities and at astonishing prices. For ordinary villagers, honey represented the principal sweetener available throughout much of the year. It flavored breads, drinks, sauces, medicinal mixtures, and festive dishes prepared for important celebrations. Children delighted in it. Nobles appreciated it. Monks depended upon it. Physicians prescribed it. A spoonful of honey therefore carried emotional weight modern people easily overlook. Imagine tasting genuine sweetness after months of coarse bread, cabbage, onions, beans, salted fish, and thick pottage. No wonder Scripture repeatedly described the Promised Land as flowing with milk and honey rather than milk and reasonably priced refined sugar. Honey seemed almost heavenly. When something proves both delicious and mysteriously produced by creatures already surrounded with symbolic meaning, people begin assigning deeper significance almost automatically. The hive itself invited endless reflection. Unlike many animals, bees behaved collectively in ways difficult for casual observers to explain. Hundreds or thousands moved with astonishing coordination. Scouts departed and returned. Workers specialized in different tasks. Guards defended entrances. Entire colonies relocated during swarms with remarkable unity. Medieval villagers watching these events lacked modern entomology but possessed abundant imagination. Perhaps bees obeyed divine instruction directly. Perhaps angels guided them. Perhaps they sensed changes invisible to humans. Perhaps they noticed approaching storms before anyone else. Perhaps they recognized moral conditions inside households. The last possibility proved especially fascinating. Across various regions, people quietly repeated stories suggesting bees reacted emotionally to their owner's behavior. Treat them kindly, and the hive prospered. Neglect them, and misfortune followed. Speak harshly nearby, and production declined. Disturb them unnecessarily, and they abandoned their home. Modern beekeepers sometimes smile knowingly at portions of these beliefs because colonies genuinely respond to environmental conditions, rough handling disease, weather, and stress. Medieval observers correctly noticed relationships while explaining them through entirely different frameworks. They concluded bees possessed remarkable awareness, perhaps even understanding. This growing respect eventually developed into one of Europe's most charming traditions. People talked to bees, not constantly, not as casual entertainment, but during moments of enormous importance. A wedding, a birth, a death, an inheritance, a departure, the arrival of a new master, the passing of an old one. Families approached hives and quietly informed the bees what had happened. To modern ears, this sounds wonderfully eccentric. Standing beside thousands of insects explaining recent family developments appears unlikely to improve communication with anyone involved. Yet for centuries, many households performed exactly this ritual with complete sincerity. Telling the bees, as later generations called it, rested upon a surprisingly logical chain of assumptions once one accepted its basic premises. If bees belonged intimately to the household, if they shared daily life, if they sensed emotional conditions, if they enjoyed mysterious connections to spiritual realities, then failing to inform them about major events appeared almost rude. Imagine everyone attending a wedding except one elderly relative left sitting alone without explanation. The omission would feel disrespectful. Some medieval people extended identical courtesy toward their hives, especially after deaths. When the head of a household died, someone might gently approach the bees and announce the sad news. Otherwise, the insects, according to widespread belief, could become restless. They might cease producing honey, leave entirely, perish unexpectedly, or somehow mirror the family's grief through mysterious decline. Whether anyone truly believed every frightening consequence hardly mattered. The custom itself strengthened emotional continuity between humans and the natural world. The bees became participants rather than property. There is something quietly beautiful about that. Modern societies often divide sharply between people and nature. Medieval Europeans certainly exploited natural resources, yet they also inhabited a world where animals, plants, landscapes, and weather participated constantly in daily imagination. Nothing remained entirely separate. Everything belonged to one enormous interconnected creation. Bees occupied one of its gentlest intersections. Travelers occasionally noticed this affection with mild surprise. A merchant arriving from another region might discover monastery gardens carefully arranged around flowering plants selected specifically for bee forage. Fruit trees stood nearby not merely because they produced apples or pears, but because blossoms nourished colonies each spring. Herb gardens overflowed with lavender thyme, rosemary sage, marjoram, and countless flowering species whose practical medicinal value blended effortlessly with their usefulness for pollinating insects. Nothing seemed wasted. Nothing existed for only one purpose. A flower healed illness, fed bees, beautified gardens, inspired poetry, pleased God. At least that was how many medieval minds naturally organized reality. The modern habit of separating everything into neat categories, economics, biology, religion, agriculture, psychology, would have seemed oddly artificial. One humble blossom could comfortably occupy every category simultaneously. The same applied to bees. They produced honey, created wax, supported orchards, inspired sermons, encouraged superstitions, connected households to invisible worlds. Few creatures worked so tirelessly across both practical necessity and symbolic meaning. And still, despite all this admiration, medieval affection carried an unmistakable thread of caution, because creatures believed capable of blessing households might also withdraw their favor. Respect always accompanied usefulness. One did not casually strike a hive. One avoided unnecessary disturbance. Children learned careful behavior early. Experienced keepers approached calmly rather than impulsively. Smoke soothed colonies long before modern explanations clarified precisely why. Gentleness became both practical technique and moral expectation. Perhaps bees rewarded kindness. Perhaps they merely responded better to careful handling. Either explanation encouraged identical behavior. History often works that way. The reasons change, the customs survive. As evening settled across monastery gardens and village orchards, the steady hum gradually softened. Workers returned carrying tiny burdens of pollen, invisible from any distance. Guards remained alert near narrow entrances. Within warm darkness, thousands of insects continued astonishingly organized lives while humans retreated indoors. Somewhere inside nearby cottages, families spread coarse bread across wooden tables. A little honey might appear for fortunate households. Candlelight flickered gently itself, another quiet gift from neighboring hives. Children listened as older relatives repeated familiar stories about saints, harvests, wandering travelers, miracles, warnings, and occasionally about bees that somehow knew more than ordinary creatures should. Few listeners doubted entirely. Few believed without question. Most settled into that comfortable middle ground where folklore quietly thrives. A place where practical observation, religious faith, inherited custom, and gentle uncertainty lived together without feeling any urgent need to separate. And in that peaceful uncertainty, surrounded by flowers' orchards, monastery walls, and softly humming hives, medieval Europe discovered one of its most extraordinary companions, not quite livestock, not quite miracle, but something beautifully suspended between the two. As twilight settled more firmly over the countryside, the world seemed to divide itself into two very different kingdoms. Inside cottages, people gathered around hearths, where the last light of the fire painted warm patterns across timber walls. Outside, the fields gradually disappeared beneath a blanket of darkness, leaving only the silhouettes of fruit trees, fences, and distant church towers. Somewhere beyond those shadows, the bees rested quietly inside their hives, packed together so closely that an entire colony behaved almost like a single living organism. Medieval villagers could not have explained the biology of what was happening inside those wooden boxes, yet they knew something extraordinary was taking place. The bees seemed to vanish each evening into a hidden society governed by rules no human eye could witness. And whenever people cannot observe something directly, the imagination happily volunteers to fill in the missing pieces. This tendency was hardly unique to the Middle Ages. Modern people invent conspiracy theories about satellites and secret laboratories. Medieval Europeans simply preferred invisible saints, wandering spirits, and unusually intelligent insects. Human beings have always disliked empty spaces in knowledge. We decorate those spaces with stories until someone invents a microscope. To appreciate just how mysterious bees appeared, imagine never having seen the inside of a modern observation hive. A colony might contain 20,000, 30,000, even 50,000 individuals, all somehow cooperating with astonishing precision. They emerged every morning in organized waves, scattered across fields, returned carrying tiny golden baskets of pollen attached to their legs, defended their home without hesitation, paired damaged comb, cared for larvae, stored food, regulated temperature, and survived harsh winters together. From the perspective of a medieval farmer, this was not simply efficient behavior. It bordered on the miraculous. Many natural philosophers inherited ideas from ancient authorities, like Aristotle and Pliny the Elder, whose writings continued circulating throughout medieval Europe. Their observations mixed genuine insight with charming misunderstandings. Some correctly recognized the remarkable organization of hives. Others confidently described behaviors that modern entomologists would gently classify as wonderfully incorrect. Medieval scholars copied these texts because ancient wisdom commanded enormous respect. If a Roman author had written something 1,000 years earlier, there was an understandable temptation to assume he probably knew what he was talking about. History repeatedly demonstrates that confidence and accuracy are distant cousins. One especially fascinating misconception involved the ruler of the hive. Today, every schoolchild learns about the queen bee. Medieval Europeans, however, often imagined the colony ruled by a king. The assumption made perfect sense according to their own political world. Kingdoms had kings, monasteries had abbots, noble households had lords, villages answered to local authorities. Why should bees organize themselves differently? The possibility that thousands of disciplined workers might willingly follow a female leader seemed considerably less obvious inside societies, where political authority usually belonged to men. Reality, as it often enjoys doing, quietly ignored human expectations. The irony is almost impossible not to appreciate. For centuries, medieval commentators praised bee colonies as models of perfect masculine leadership, while unknowingly admiring one of nature's most successful female-led societies. The bees fortunately displayed no interest whatsoever in correcting the misunderstanding. This tiny historical mistake reveals something surprisingly profound about the relationship between observation and assumption. Medieval people genuinely watched bees with great care. They noticed countless accurate details. Yet, when evidence became difficult to interpret, they naturally explained it using familiar ideas borrowed from their own society. We continue doing exactly the same thing today, only with different subjects and considerably more expensive technology. Religious symbolism deepened these interpretations even further. Medieval sermons frequently compared Christian communities to orderly hives. Every believer possessed responsibilities. Pride threatened harmony. Laziness endangered everyone. Hard work benefited the whole community. The comparison practically wrote itself. Monks especially admired bees because monasteries also function through disciplined cooperation. Individual desires mattered less than collective purpose. Picture a Benedictine monastery shortly after sunrise. The bell rings. Monks rise from simple beds. Morning prayers begin. Gardens require attention. Fields need cultivation. Manuscripts await careful copying. Meals must be prepared. Candles require making. Medicines demand mixing. Nearby, thousands of bees leave their hive almost simultaneously to begin another day of equally disciplined labor. One can hardly blame medieval monks for feeling a certain kinship. Of course, the bees enjoyed one significant advantage. They never held committee meetings. Their administrative efficiency remains rather enviable. Monasteries became centers of practical beekeeping, not only because of symbolism, but because necessity quietly demanded it. Honey served as one of the most versatile ingredients available. Physicians mixed it into herbal remedies because they observed that wounds treated with honey often healed surprisingly well. They lacked modern microbiology, of course, but experience repeatedly suggested honey possessed remarkable healing qualities. Centuries later, scientists would discover antibacterial properties that medieval healers recognized only through observation. History occasionally rewards patient guesswork. Honey appeared in cough remedies, digestive treatments, ointments, syrups, and soothing mixtures intended for sore throats or infected cuts. A medieval infirmary without honey resembled a modern first aid kit missing antiseptic cream. Physicians might disagree about Humour's astrology or appropriate bloodletting schedules, but few questioned honey's usefulness. Beeswax proved equally indispensable. Beyond church candles, it sealed important documents, protected thread, coated wooden objects, appeared in medicinal salves, lubricated equipment, helped preserve certain materials. Even artists valued its remarkable properties. One tiny colony quietly supplied products supporting religion, medicine, administration, craftsmanship, and domestic life simultaneously. Imagine explaining this economic versatility to someone who believes bees exist primarily to inconvenience summer picnics. The bees would probably remain politely unimpressed. Despite their practical importance, however, medieval people rarely discussed bees without eventually drifting toward superstition. Practical experience and folklore coexisted comfortably. One never excluded the other. A beekeeper might understand precisely when swarms usually emerge during spring, while simultaneously believing certain prayers protected hives from misfortune. Contradiction rarely troubled medieval minds. as much as it troubles modern commentators. Reality itself appeared layered. God governed creation. Nature followed recognizable patterns. Miracles occasionally interrupted those patterns. Saints offered protection. Demons sought opportunities. Plants possessed medicinal properties. Some places remained unlucky. These ideas occupied overlapping rather than competing territories. Bees fit neatly into every layer. Perhaps nowhere is this more charmingly illustrated than the widespread custom later known as telling the bees. Although surviving evidence varies across regions and centuries, the tradition became deeply rooted in parts of Europe and endured remarkably long afterward. Whenever major family events occurred, someone informed the hives. A daughter married. The bees should know. A child was born. The bees should know. The household prepared to move. The bees should know. Most importantly, someone died. The bees absolutely must know. To modern ears, this resembles speaking gently with beloved pets. Yet medieval attitudes often carried even greater seriousness. The bees belonged to the household almost as witnesses. Ignoring them risked upsetting an invisible balance. Stories circulated describing colonies abandoning homes after their owners neglected this duty. Others insisted bees would cease producing honey. Still others whispered darker possibilities involving prolonged bad luck. Whether every village believed identical versions scarcely matters. The remarkable fact is that enough people considered such customs meaningful for generations. Anthropologists often point out that rituals surrounding death help surviving family members process grief. Informing the bees may have served precisely that purpose. Standing quietly before the hive forced mourners to acknowledge change aloud. The ritual transformed private sorrow into shared continuity. Even if one doubted the insects literally understood human speech, the act itself provided comfort. There is something unexpectedly tender about imagining a grieving widow stepping into an orchard at dawn, placing one weathered hand upon the wooden hive, and softly explaining that her husband would never return. Not because she expected a conversation, but because leaving faithful companions uninformed somehow felt wrong. History contains countless examples of human beings searching for listeners when ordinary language proves insufficient. Sometimes they found priests, sometimes friends, sometimes rivers, sometimes trees, sometimes bees. Medieval folklore occasionally attributed almost uncanny sensitivity to hives. Bees supposedly detected approaching storms before clouds visibly gathered. They behaved differently before harsh winters. They reacted strangely around certain visitors. Experienced keepers genuinely observed subtle behavioral changes related to weather temperature, scent, and environmental conditions. Lacking modern explanations, many concluded bees perceived realities hidden from ordinary human senses. Oddly enough, they were partially correct. Modern research demonstrates that bees detect vibrations, polarized light, electrical fields, atmospheric changes, and chemical signals beyond human perception. Their explanations differed. Their observations often did not. This recurring pattern appears throughout history. People notice genuine phenomena, then explain them according to available knowledge. Future generations mock the explanations while quietly rediscovering the observations. Bees also occupied an intriguing place within medieval ideas about the soul. Christian doctrine naturally distinguished humans from animals, yet ordinary villagers frequently entertained gentler ambiguities. Certain creatures appeared unusually close to spiritual realities. Ravens gathered around battlefields. White stags wandered through legends. Wolves inspired uneasy respect. Bees, however, occupied a far kinder category. Their orderly lives suggested divine intention rather than chaos. Their products benefited humanity. Their behavior resembled disciplined communities. Unlike scavengers or predators, bees transform flowers into sweetness. That symbolism proved irresistible. Some religious writers even compared faithful Christians to bees, collecting virtues instead of nectar. Every good deed resembled another drop of honey stored within the soul. One imagines particularly exhausted parishioners nodding politely through such sermons, while privately wondering whether the bees might also volunteer to weed monastery gardens. Unfortunately, theological metaphors rarely extend quite that far. As evening approached, monasteries often became astonishingly peaceful places. Bees gradually returned from surrounding fields. Monks gathered for prayers. Candle flames flickered beneath vaulted ceilings. Outside orchards settled into stillness, interrupted only by distant birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. Within those quiet moments, bees almost disappeared from view, yet everyone knew they remained nearby, safe inside carefully tended hives, working invisibly, preparing for tomorrow. There is a curious lesson hidden there. Human beings generally celebrate visible accomplishments. Medieval bees spent much of their existence accomplishing remarkable things where almost nobody could see them. Perhaps that is why they inspired such admiration. Their greatest work happened quietly, without applause, without recognition, without expecting monuments. Only honey, only wax, only another generation surviving the winter. Perhaps history itself resembles that hive more than we realize. Most civilizations are built not by famous rulers, but by countless anonymous workers whose names vanished centuries ago. Like bees, their labor sweetened lives they would never meet. Their efforts illuminated churches where others prayed. Their work disappeared into ordinary existence so completely that later generations forgot it had ever required extraordinary dedication. And maybe that is the strangest miracle of all. By the time a medieval summer reached its fullest bloom, the countryside itself seemed to hum with quiet industry. Wheat bent gently beneath warm breezes. Orchards glowed with swelling fruit, herb gardens overflowed with fragrance, and somewhere beyond almost every hedge, bees traced invisible highways between thousands of blossoms. If someone had asked an ordinary villager whether bees were important, the answer would probably have been so obvious that the question itself might seem rather silly. Asking whether bees mattered would have been a bit like asking whether rain bread or fire deserved appreciation. Of course they did. Life simply worked better because they existed. Yet, what is remarkable is not merely that medieval Europeans depended upon bees. Entire civilizations have relied upon pollinators without wrapping them in layers of symbolism. The truly fascinating part is how easily practical dependence transformed into emotional attachment. The closer people lived to nature, the more difficult it became to separate usefulness from personality. Medieval villagers rarely imagined themselves standing above the natural world as detached observers. Instead, they lived inside it. The seasons governed their work. Animals shaped their routines. Trees marked family histories. Rivers decided trade. Weather determined survival. Bees became neighbors. Modern life has quietly erased many of these relationships. Someone living in a 20th floor apartment might spend weeks without consciously noticing a single bee. Honey arrives in identical plastic bottles beneath supermarket lights, divorced entirely from flowers' hives and patient insects. Medieval people experienced the opposite. Every spoonful carried memories of buzzing orchards, careful beekeepers, warm afternoons, and flowering meadows. Food still possessed visible origins. That closeness encouraged another curious belief. Many medieval Europeans became convinced that bees understood human character better than humans understood themselves. This may sound delightfully absurd until one remembers how easily people interpret animal behavior as moral judgment. Even today, someone might proudly announce that dogs always know who's a good person. Cats, according to popular opinion, somehow detect suspicious personalities. Horses supposedly sense fear. Dolphins recognize kindness. We remain surprisingly eager to recruit animals as judges of human virtue. Medieval villagers extended this tendency toward bees. A calm beekeeper often enjoyed calmer colonies. An impatient one seemed to suffer more stings. Someone who approached with steady movements appeared to receive better results than someone waving their arms in panic. Modern entomology explains these differences through scent vibrations, defensive responses, and carbon dioxide. Medieval observers preferred a simpler explanation. The bees knew not merely what you were doing, who you were. There is an oddly comforting innocence hidden inside that conclusion. Imagine believing that honesty, patience, humility, and gentleness became visible to tiny golden insect. One suddenly feels rather obligated to improve one's manners. Whether bees cared remained an entirely separate matter. As stories accumulated through generations, the hives themselves acquired personalities. Every village seemed to possess at least one elderly beekeeper, capable of recounting remarkable tales with complete confidence. One colony allegedly refused to survive after its owner died because nobody informed them of the funeral. Another supposedly abandoned a greedy landowner, but flourished once inherited by his kinder daughter. Somewhere else, bees allegedly swarmed above a newborn child, interpreting the event as an especially favorable sign. These stories spread not because anyone carefully documented evidence, but because they expressed something communities already wanted to believe. That goodness attracted goodness. That care produced abundance. That nature rewarded respect. History repeatedly demonstrates that human beings treasure stories, reinforcing moral order. Reality occasionally cooperates. Folklore rarely waits for confirmation. One particularly enduring belief involved swarming. Today, beekeepers understand swarming as a natural reproductive process. Colonies simply become crowded, produce a new queen, and divide. Medieval villagers certainly observed the phenomenon, but witnessing thousands of bees suddenly pour into the sky produced understandable astonishment. A swarm resembled a living cloud spinning and swirling before eventually settling upon a branch or fence. If one had never encountered such an event before, it must have looked almost supernatural. Entire villages sometimes emerged from houses simply to watch. Children stared open-mouthed. Farmers abandoned tools. Women paused household work. Dogs barked in bewilderment. And somewhere amid the excitement stood the beekeeper, hoping the swarm would choose somewhere convenient, rather than disappearing forever into distant woodland. Naturally, such dramatic spectacles accumulated interpretations. Some regarded swarms as blessings, others viewed them cautiously. A colony unexpectedly arriving near one's property could be interpreted as divine favor. Losing one, however, invited quieter anxieties. Had someone offended God, neglected responsibilities, forgotten an important custom, or perhaps the bees had simply followed perfectly ordinary biological instincts? The latter explanation received considerably less attention. Human beings rarely tell exciting stories about insects behaving exactly as evolution intended. Monasteries contributed another layer to these beliefs through the enormous importance of beeswax candles. It is surprisingly difficult to overstate how central candles were to medieval religious life. Every dawn prayer, every evening service, every funeral, every feast day, every vigil, every baptism, every monastery library, and countless hours of manuscript copying depended upon reliable light. That light came from bees. Imagine a monk spending decades copying sacred texts one careful letter at a time beneath the glow of beeswax candles. His entire intellectual world literally unfolded through their light. Without bees, fewer manuscripts survive. Without manuscripts, fewer ideas endure. Without those ideas, European intellectual history follows a dramatically different path. Tiny insects quietly influenced civilizations in ways impossible for medieval observers to calculate. History possesses a delightful sense of proportion. The smallest workers occasionally support the largest achievements. Medieval physicians also admired bees for reasons extending beyond honey itself. They experimented with propolis, though naturally they did not describe it using modern chemical terminology. Sticky substances gathered by bees occasionally appeared in folk remedies. Wax entered ointments. Honey soothed wounds. Even bee stings attracted occasional medical curiosity. While few physicians intentionally encouraged repeated stinging, as routine treatment observations accumulated, suggesting that bee venom sometimes influenced pain or inflammation. Modern researchers continue investigating similar possibilities. Again, medieval explanations differ dramatically. Their observations sometimes wandered surprisingly close. This recurring pattern becomes almost hypnotic while studying history. People noticed reality, misunderstood its mechanisms, yet still preserved useful practices. Scientific progress often resembles translating old observations into better explanations, rather than replacing ignorance with entirely new discoveries. Perhaps the greatest irony surrounding medieval bees concerns wealth. Honey was valuable. Beeswax was valuable. Strong colonies generated income. Successful beekeepers acquired respected reputations. Yet unlike precious metals locked inside chests, wealth built upon bees remained alive. It flew away if neglected, fell ill, swarmed unexpectedly, required constant attention. Prosperity literally buzzed. Imagine explaining modern investment portfolios to a medieval beekeeper. So, your fortune exists mostly inside invisible numbers. He might politely nod, then quietly return to trusting insects. Honestly, one cannot entirely blame him. The relationship between bees and flowers also encouraged medieval reflections about divine order. Spring did not merely produce blossoms. It awakened an entire invisible economy. Trees flowered. Bees arrived. Fruit developed. Harvest followed. Seeds formed. Life continued. Interrupt one step, and countless others suffered. Nobody understood pollination scientifically, but everyone recognized practical connections. Fruit trees blossomed more abundantly where bees flourished. Fields seemed healthier. Gardens prospered. Many interpreted these relationships spiritually. Creation cooperated because God designed it wisely. One flower alone achieved little. One bee alone accomplished little. Together, they transformed landscapes. There is quiet poetry inside that observation, regardless of one's beliefs. Even medieval artists occasionally slipped bees into illuminated manuscripts. Sometimes they appear decorating borders among flowers. Elsewhere, they symbolized industriousness or spiritual sweetness. A patient reader might spend hours examining elaborate manuscript pages before suddenly discovering one tiny bee hiding beside painted ivy leaves. These small artistic choices reveal something important. Nobody included bees because they frightened audiences. They appeared because people found them quietly admirable. History often reserves its deepest affection for ordinary companions rather than spectacular heroes. Not dragons, not lions, not mythical monsters, simply bees. There were, of course, practical dangers. Beekeeping demanded courage. Modern protective suits would have appeared wonderfully magical to medieval keepers. Most relied upon experience, smoke, careful timing, and remarkable tolerance for occasional stings. Some undoubtedly suffered severe reactions without understanding why. Others became astonishingly skilled, moving confidently among hives, while newcomers watched from comfortable distances, offering advice that contributed absolutely nothing. Certain aspects of human behavior remain beautifully timeless. Every experienced craftsperson eventually acquires at least one spectator, convinced the work looks much easier than it actually is. The bees generally settled such debates rather efficiently. As autumn approached each year, another transformation unfolded. Flowers gradually disappeared. Days shortened. Colonies slowed. Honey stores became precious reserves rather than fresh abundance. Medieval keepers watched carefully, hoping enough food remained for winter survival. Greed could easily destroy next year's prosperity. Take too much honey and the colony starved. Leave enough and everyone benefited later. That required patience. Immediate profit tempted. Long-term survival demanded restraint. It is astonishing how often history reduces itself to exactly that choice. The medieval beekeeper understood something many civilizations repeatedly forget. Prosperity cannot survive endless extraction. Even bees require tomorrow. And perhaps that gentle lesson, carried quietly across centuries inside humming orchards and monastery gardens, explains why these remarkable insects became something greater than livestock. They became teachers, not because they spoke, but because patient observation revealed wisdom hidden inside ordinary work. While kingdoms rose and fell, while nobles argued over borders, while bishops debated theology, and kings pursued glory, thousands upon thousands of anonymous bees continued visiting flowers exactly as they always had, completely indifferent to human ambition. Entire empires eventually disappeared. The bees simply found another blossom. Winter brought a very different rhythm to medieval Europe, and nowhere was that change felt more quietly than around the beehives. During spring and summer, the colonies seemed almost impossibly busy, filling the air with their constant movement. By late autumn, the buzzing gradually faded until one cold morning, the hives appeared almost abandoned. Snow collected on their roofs. Frost settled across nearby orchards. Bare branches scratched gently against pale skies. To someone unfamiliar with bees, it might have looked as though the entire colony had vanished. Yet medieval beekeepers knew better. They understood, at least through long experience, that the hive was not empty. It had simply withdrawn into itself. Thousands of bees clustered tightly together around their queen, vibrating tiny flight muscles to generate warmth. Modern science now explains this remarkable feat in terms of thermoregulation and collective metabolism. Medieval villagers simply observed that somehow impossibly, life continued inside what looked like a frozen wooden box. Once again, observation came first. Explanation followed later. And because the explanation remained mysterious, imagination eagerly stepped forward. Many people quietly believed winter hives occupied a strange threshold between the visible and invisible worlds. During summer, the bees belonged to fields and flowers. During winter, they disappeared into darkness, surviving without anyone witnessing their daily lives. It almost resembled death, followed by resurrection every single year. One can understand why this inspired reflection. Medieval Europeans lived in societies where winter carried genuine uncertainty. Food supplies diminished. Livestock required constant care. Roads became dangerous. Illness spread more easily indoors. Entire villages slowed almost to a standstill while waiting for spring's return. Against this backdrop, the bees became tiny symbols of hope, hidden beneath wooden lids. If they survived, perhaps everyone else would too. The connection between bees and resurrection appeared naturally in Christian symbolism. Preachers often spoke about apparent endings concealing future beginnings. Seeds vanished underground before sprouting again. Trees lost every leaf before blooming more beautifully the following spring. The hive seemed to follow the same divine rhythm: silent, hidden, patient, alive. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate how different medieval time felt compared with modern life. Today, many people expect instant results. Messages arrive immediately. Deliveries appear overnight. Information crosses oceans in seconds. Medieval villagers measured time differently. They trusted seasons rather than schedules. A hive could teach patience better than almost any sermon. Honey itself required months. Wax accumulated slowly. Colonies strengthened gradually. Nothing important happened particularly fast. Nature possessed absolutely no interest in deadlines. Some medieval writers even described bees as examples of proper Christian humility, because every individual appeared willing to sacrifice personal comfort for the entire community. Modern biology explains these behaviors through genetics and evolutionary adaptation, but medieval observers interpreted them morally. Worker bees seemed astonishingly selfless. They defended the hive at enormous personal risk. They labored endlessly. They accepted clearly defined roles without complaint. Of course, if someone had attempted to interview an actual worker bee regarding workplace satisfaction, the conversation might have proceeded rather differently. Unfortunately, medieval journalism had certain practical limitations. Still, the symbolism proved powerful. Entire religious communities admired these insects not because they imagined them perfect, but because they seemed wonderfully disciplined. Interestingly, discipline itself carried different meanings during the Middle Ages. Today, the word often suggests rigid rules or unpleasant obligations. Medieval thinkers frequently associated discipline with harmony. A well-run monastery functioned harmoniously because everyone fulfilled responsibilities. A healthy village survived because neighbors cooperated. A successful hive flourished because every bee performed necessary work. Order was comforting, chaos was frightening, and bees represented order almost beyond human comprehension. Yet alongside admiration existed genuine caution. Disturbing a hive carelessly remained one of the quickest ways to transform peaceful insects into highly motivated defenders. Medieval beekeepers respected this reality profoundly. Certain days seemed better suited for inspections than others. Weather mattered. Timing mattered. Movement mattered. Loud noises sometimes seemed unwise. Even if some associated precautions arose from folklore rather than entomology, the overall attitude encouraged gentleness. Modern experts would probably approve. Sometimes superstition accidentally teaches excellent practical habits. Take your time. Move slowly. Avoid unnecessary disturbance. Whether one attributes success to saints or pheromones, the bees generally appreciate the result. Medieval law occasionally reflected the economic importance of hives as well. Honey and beeswax represented valuable property. Stealing hives could provoke surprisingly serious consequences. In some regions, Ownership disputes became surprisingly complicated when swarms settled upon neighboring land. If a colony abandoned one property and established itself elsewhere, whose bees were they now? The insects themselves displayed almost complete indifference toward these legal debates. Humans, meanwhile, demonstrated their remarkable ability to complicate nearly everything. Certain customary laws attempted sensible compromises. Others produced wonderfully tangled arguments. One suspects the bees would have preferred simply returning to flowers. Winter evenings also encouraged storytelling, and bees inevitably appeared in many fireside conversations. Children listened, while grandparents recounted curious tales collected across decades. Some stories praised remarkable hives surviving impossible winters. Others warned against foolish behavior. A few wandered joyfully into complete fantasy. Perhaps a traveler once encountered bees guiding him safely through dense fog. Perhaps a saint calmed an angry swarm with prayer. Perhaps a dishonest man stole honey only to discover every spoonful mysteriously disappeared before reaching home. Historical accuracy occasionally surrendered gracefully to memorable storytelling. Yet beneath these legends lay something surprisingly practical. Stories preserved values. Respect nature. Avoid greed. Honor promises. Care for neighbors. Observe patiently. Think ahead. The bees simply provided memorable characters. Even children learning these tales absorbed lessons extending far beyond insects. One delightful feature of medieval folklore is its refusal to separate entertainment from instruction. A bedtime story could simultaneously amuse, educate, warn, comfort, and reinforce community traditions. Modern audiences often categorize information into separate compartments. Education belongs here. Entertainment belongs there. Spiritual reflection somewhere else entirely. Medieval storytelling cheerfully ignored such boundaries. Everything belonged together, just as bees transformed countless flowers into one shared sweetness. Storytellers gathered practical observations, religious ideas, village gossip, morale lessons, and imagination into single narratives. There is something rather beautiful about that approach. The changing seasons also reminded medieval people of another uncomfortable truth. Human lives resembled bee colonies more closely than anyone wished. Generations came and went. Children inherited work begun by parents. Communities survived because individuals accepted temporary roles inside larger stories. No single bee created an entire hive. No single villager built an entire village. One generation planted orchards whose fruit another generation harvested. Medieval Europeans thought about continuity constantly because daily life required it. Cathedrals sometimes took centuries. Oak trees matured slowly. Families accumulated land across generations. Bee colonies themselves often outlived individual keepers. There is a quiet humility hidden inside recognizing that one's greatest achievements may benefit people never personally known. The bees seemed perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. Perhaps humans occasionally struggled more. By late winter, subtle changes began almost imperceptibly. The sun lingered slightly longer. Snow melted unevenly beneath stone walls. Tiny green shoots appeared where frozen earth recently dominated. Inside the hives, activity gradually increased. Medieval keepers listened carefully. Yes, listened. Experienced beekeepers often judged colony health simply by placing an ear gently against the wooden hive. A healthy winter cluster produced a soft, steady humming. Silence carried heavier implications. Imagine standing quietly beneath gray February skies, pressing your ear against rough timber, hoping to hear that gentle vibration continuing inside. No complicated instruments, no laboratory equipment, only careful attention. History repeatedly rewards those willing to listen patiently. Eventually, the first warm day arrived. A handful of bees emerged cautiously into sunlight, then dozens, then hundreds. Another year had begun. The medieval beekeeper probably smiled, perhaps offered a quiet prayer, perhaps simply nodded with satisfaction. Either way, life continued. The bees resumed their endless conversation with flowers, trees, and seasons exactly as they had done long before medieval Europe existed and long after it disappeared. Empires collapsed, dynasties ended, languages changed, borders shifted. The bees kept flying. There is something profoundly comforting about that realization. Human history often feels overwhelmingly dramatic because historians naturally record wars, kings, revolutions, disasters, and triumphs. Nature records different events. Spring arrived, flowers bloomed, bees gathered nectar, winter passed, then spring returned once more. Perhaps that quieter history deserves attention too. After all, without it, none of the louder history could have survived very long. As our long, gentle journey through medieval beekeeping finally begins to settle into stillness, it becomes easier to understand why these tiny creatures occupied such an extraordinary place inside the medieval imagination. At first glance, they seem almost too small to deserve so much attention. They never built castles. They never wore crowns. They never commanded armies or signed treaties. They simply flew from flower to flower, carrying invisible grains of pollen, while quietly constructing golden stores of honey, hidden inside wooden hives. Yet in their patient labor, medieval Europeans discovered lessons about work community faith, mortality, generosity, and hope that felt larger than the insects themselves. The remarkable irony is that the bees themselves remained entirely unaware of the stories humans wrapped around them. A colony never intended to predict a funeral, bless a marriage, or comfort a grieving widow. It simply followed rhythms that had existed for millions of years before a single monastery stood upon European soil. Humans, as they have always done, looked at something beautiful and orderly and began searching for meaning. Sometimes they found practical wisdom. Sometimes they created enchanting folklore. Most often, they found a little of both. Throughout tonight's quiet investigation, we have wandered through monastery gardens, where monks carefully tended hives that illuminated cathedrals with beeswax candles. We have stood beside village orchards, where beekeepers listened closely to the comforting hum inside winter colonies. We have watched families gently whisper news of births, weddings, and deaths to their faithful bees, believing that these tiny companions deserve to remain part of the household story. We have seen how honey sweetened food, soothed wounds, preserved fruit, flavored celebrations, and quietly connected ordinary people to the changing seasons around them. Perhaps even more fascinating is how often medieval people arrived at observations that contained genuine wisdom even when their explanations wandered into folklore. They recognized that bees flourished under patient care. They understood that flowers and insects depended upon one another. They learned that taking too much honey endangered the future. They noticed that nature rewarded careful attention rather than careless haste. Their science remained incomplete, but their experience often pointed them toward truths that modern biology would later explain in greater detail. This is one of history's gentlest reminders. Human beings have always been trying to understand the world. Sometimes they guessed correctly. Sometimes they guessed beautifully. Sometimes they guessed both. The medieval relationship with bees also reveals something surprisingly comforting about the human mind itself. We are creatures who rarely accept that survival alone is enough. Bread becomes tradition. Gardens become memories. Animals become companions. Work becomes ritual. Even insects become neighbors with personalities, habits, and stories worth preserving. Across every civilization, people have quietly transformed ordinary necessities into sources of meaning. Perhaps that is one reason history feels endlessly fascinating. It is not merely a record of what happened. It is a record of how people chose to understand what happened. The bees continued gathering nectar regardless. The humans wrote poems. There is room in the world for both. And now, as evening grows deeper around us, it becomes strangely easy to imagine one final medieval village settling into peaceful silence. The day's labor has ended. Smoke drifts lazily from cottage chimneys. Livestock rest quietly inside wooden barns. Somewhere beyond the orchard, the last light of sunset slips gently beneath the horizon. The monastery bell has already echoed across nearby fields. Doors close softly against the cool night air. Candles flicker inside small windows. Families finish their final conversations before sleep. Outside, the hives remain still. Inside each one, thousands of bees gather together in quiet warmth, surrounding their queen as they have done through countless winters. No one hears their tiny movements from inside the cottages. No one sees the invisible patience with which they protect one another through the darkness. Yet life continues inside those humble wooden walls, unnoticed by almost everyone. Tomorrow, if the weather is kind, they will fly again. If not tomorrow, then another day. There is no urgency. Nature has never been in a hurry, and perhaps that is the final lesson these remarkable little creatures leave behind. The medieval world often appeared frightening, uncertain, and unpredictable. Harvests failed. Winters lingered. Illness arrived without warning. Roads remained dangerous. Lives could change overnight. Yet amid all that uncertainty, the bees continued following rhythms older than kingdoms themselves. They trusted the seasons. They trusted the flowers that would eventually bloom again. They trusted that after every winter, however long, spring quietly returned. History tells us that every generation believed its own worries were uniquely overwhelming. The bees gently disagreed. They simply kept working, long after the kings were forgotten, long after the castles weathered into ruins, long after the names of ordinary villagers disappeared from memory. The bees continued their ancient conversation with blossoms beneath the same patient sky. And now, perhaps as your own thoughts begin to grow softer, you can leave those distant monastery gardens behind. Let the buzzing fade into the background until it becomes almost impossible to distinguish from the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. Imagine the cool evening settling gently across the fields, the orchard standing peacefully beneath the stars, and the wooden hives resting safely beneath the moonlight, each one holding a tiny, sleeping community that has asked for nothing more than another quiet dawn. The medieval villagers have long since returned to dust. Their cottages have vanished. Their orchards have changed. Their voices have faded into history. Yet somewhere tonight, beneath another moon, bees still drift home carrying the last sweetness of the day, just as they always have. And with that gentle thought, there is nothing left to do. No fields to harvest, no candles to trim, no hives to tend. Only the quiet comfort of knowing that while human lives pass like seasons, the soft hum of the natural world continues patiently onward, carrying its ancient stories through one peaceful night after another, inviting us, at least for this evening, to simply close our eyes and rest.